Ran Creek Valley, the Wild West. March when the cold still hadn't loosened its grip. Rosa stood her ground, both hands flat on the mahogany desk, staring straight into her father's eyes, pale gray, cold as winter creek water. Sign it. Ephraim Mercer slid the marriage contract toward her. No, her voice didn't shake. His face didn't change. He picked up the contract, tore it down the middle, then tore it again. Then you're no daughter of mine. Clear your room by sundown. Rosa turned and walked out without a word. She didn't cry until she was around the corner, standing alone in the cold March wind, with nothing left to show for 27 years of her life. But she only let herself cry for 2 hours. Then she borrowed a mule and rode straight up to Bitterbutt Ridge to bet everything on the man the whole valley called half out of his mind. Follow along now to find out what happens when the two loneliest souls in the valley choose each other. The offices of Mercer Freight smelled like pipe tobacco and old money. Rosalie Mercer had sat across from her father's mahogany desk 100 times in her life, but never like this. Never with her hands folded so tight in her lap that her knuckles went white. Ephraim Mercer didn't look up from the contract on his desk. He just turned it around and slid it toward her with one thick finger. "Sign it," he said. Rosa looked at the paper. Garrett Burke's name was printed at the top in bold black ink. Below it, her own name appeared in neat cursive, like something already decided. A marriage agreement, dressed up in legal language to make it sound like a business arrangement, which, she supposed, was exactly what it was. "No," she said. Ephraim finally looked up. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter creek water. "Rosalie, no, father." He leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers over his stomach. "Burke has connections in Washington. The military beef contract goes through him. You sign that paper, and Mercer Freight doubles its revenue by spring. And what do I get? Security, a husband, a proper life." He said it like those 3 things were the only things worth wanting. Rosa stood up. She planted both hands flat on the desk and looked him straight in the eye. "You've sold my eye for cattle for 9 years and called it fatherly protection. I am a human being with a soul, not an asset on your ledger." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like smoke. Ephraim's face didn't change. He reached across the desk, picked up the contract, and tore it down the middle. Then he tore it again. The pieces fluttered to the floor between them. "Fine," he said. "Then you're no daughter of mine. Clear your room by sundown. Leave the wages you're owed on my bookkeeper's desk. The bay mare goes back to the stable she's registered in my name." He paused. "And the saddle?" Rosa's stomach dropped. "That saddle belonged to my mother. Everything under this roof belongs to me." He picked up his pipe. Sundown, Rosalie, she walked out without another word. She didn't cry until she was around the corner of the building, out of sight of the windows, standing in the cold March wind with absolutely nothing to show for 27 years of her life. She spent 2 hours thinking. Then she borrowed a mule from Bat Tolliver. Bat was somewhere north of 60. With a face like cracked saddle leather and eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He'd driven stagecoach for Mercer Freight for 30 years, before his hip gave out. He was the only person in Rand Creek Valley who'd ever taught Rosa anything she actually needed to know. "Where you headed?" he asked, watching her cinch up the borrowed tack. "Bitterbutt Ridge." Bat was quiet for a moment. "Hawk's place." "Yes," another pause. "That's a long ride on a mule." "I know he's broke, Rosa. Half the valley thinks he's touched in the head, lives up there alone except for that orphan boy he took in." Rosa checked the bridle and swung up. "I know what people say about him, Bat. What do you know about him that people don't say?" She thought about it. She thought about that morning, 3 weeks ago, when she'd been driving her father's wagon past the old Henderson widow's place. She'd seen Gideon Hawk stacking firewood against the widow's porch wall. A full cord of it, split and stacked neat. He'd hitched his own horse to the post and worked in silence for 2 hours. When Mrs. Hayes came out to thank him, she'd seen him shake his head, press his hat to his chest, and ride away before the woman could offer him so much as a cup of coffee. That was his last haul. She'd heard later he'd had nothing to burn that night himself. "I know enough," Rosa said, and nudged the mule north. The ride up to Bitterbutt Ridge took the better part of the afternoon. The sun was already dropping toward the western peaks by the time the trail leveled out into the ridge property, and the cold came down fast, the way it did in high country. Thin snow had settled over the brown grass, dusting the fence rails and the roof of the main cabin. The outfit looked poor. There was no getting around it. The barn needed new boards on the south wall. The bunkhouse roof had a visible sag in the middle. 2 horses stood in the paddock, both solid animals, but nothing fancy. A dog barked twice from somewhere behind the cabin, then went quiet. Rosa climbed down from the mule and was working on keeping her footing on the icy ground when she heard boots on the porch steps. Gideon Hawk was taller than she remembered. She'd seen him in town. Of course, Rand Creek wasn't so big that you missed people, but she'd never stood this close to him. He had a stillness about him that wasn't unfriendliness exactly. It was more like a man who'd learned a long time ago that most things weren't worth making noise about. He wore a canvas coat with a sheepskin collar, and the cold had reddened the sharp line of his jaw. His eyes were dark and very steady. He was down the porch steps in 3 strides when her boots hit a patch of ice. She didn't fall. He caught her at the waist. Before it came to that, one hand firm and certain, steadying her like it was nothing at all. She pulled back and straightened her coat. He let go immediately. "Said nothing, Mr. Hawk," she said. "I'm Rosa Mercer. I know who you are." His voice was low and unhurried. "What brings you to Bitterbutt Ridge?" "I have a proposal." He looked at her. Then he nodded once toward the cabin. "Come inside. There's coffee." The inside of the cabin was plain but not dirty. A cast-iron stove, a scrubbed pine table. A boy of about 16 sat near the window, one leg in a brace, working at a leather strap with an awl. He looked up at Rosa with curious dark eyes, and Gideon said, "Toby, go check the water trough." And the boy nodded and swung himself up on a crutch without complaint and went out. Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across the table and waited. Rosa put her hands around the cup. She'd rehearsed this on the mule ride up, and now, sitting here with him, watching her with those patient eyes, the rehearsal seemed a little thin. "My father disowned me this morning," she said. "He took my wages, my horse, and my mother's saddle. I have $11, a borrowed mule, and 9 years of experience handling cattle that most men in this valley would pay good money for." Gideon didn't say anything. "I'm proposing a business marriage, a legal arrangement. You get my cattle skills, I can read a herd, estimate weights, spot sickness before it spreads. I'll work Bitterbutt Ridge like it's my own, because legally it would be. Half the work, half the earned income." She met his eyes. "You get my name off the street and out of my father's reach. I get a legal name he can't touch and a place to work." The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the last of the light was going gold and then gray. Gideon looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked at her. "You're not afraid to live out here?" "I'm afraid of exactly 2 things, Mr. Hawk. Wasting my life and becoming my father. This ridge doesn't threaten either of those." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that. "All right," he said. Rosa blinked. "All right. I'll need a few days to arrange a ceremony. 8 witnesses minimum for the county record." He stood and picked up his cup. "You can have the east room. I'll move my gear to the bunkhouse tonight." "Wait." She stood too. "You're not going to ask me more questions?" He considered that. "You rode a borrowed mule 4 miles up a ridge in freezing weather to ask a broke cowboy to marry you." He looked at her steadily. "I figure you've already answered every question worth asking." He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening snow. Rosa stood in the warm lamplight of that plain little cabin, coffee in hand, heart hammering in a way she hadn't expected. Outside, the first true dark of evening settled over Bitterbutt Ridge. The snow caught what was left of the light and held it, faintly glowing. 2 lonely people, 1 hard bargain, and something between them that neither one was ready to name. The wedding happened on a Thursday. 8 witnesses crowded into the Rand Creek County Clerk's office, which smelled like dust and old paper, and the particular mustiness of official things. Bat Tolliver stood at Rosa's left shoulder. Toby Miller stood at Gideon's right, his crutch tucked under his arm, his good shirt buttoned to the collar. The other 6 witnesses were neighbors from the Valley homesteaders mostly, men and women who knew Gideon well enough to show up when he asked and to keep their questions to themselves. The clerk read the words. Gideon said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet and clear. Rosa said hers just as steadily. They signed the register. The clerk stamped it, and that was that. No flowers, no celebration, no wedding supper, except for the pot of beans Toby had left simmering back at the cabin. On the ride home, Rosa and Gideon sat side by side on the wagon bench and didn't speak much. The valley spread out around them, brown and wide, the mountains sitting blue and cold at the edges. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had made a practical decision and were now living inside it. Back at Bitterbutt Ridge, Gideon unhitched the team while Rosa brought her single bag into the east room. The room was small and plain. A bed with a wool blanket, a window that looked out over the south pasture, a wooden peg on the wall for hanging things. She set her bag down and stood there a moment, looking at the peg. Gideon appeared in the doorway. He didn't come in. He leaned one shoulder against the frame and looked at her with his usual steadiness. "I want to set out the terms," he said. "Since we're doing this properly." Rosa turned around. "Go ahead. This room is yours. I won't come in unless you invite me. If you want the door locked, I'll put a bolt on it tomorrow morning." He paused. "And if you ever want to leave any day, any reason, no questions, I'll hitch the team and drive you to the depot myself. No scenes." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. In her experience, men who said things like that usually meant the opposite. But Gideon's face was plain and open, and he said it the way a man states a fact about the weather, like it simply was what it was. "All right," she said. "My terms, then. I'm listening. No partial truths. If something concerns this ranch or my work on it, I hear the full story, not the version you think I can handle." She crossed her arms, "And my cattle bear my own brand, bar R. Whatever I earn with my own labor is mine." Gideon nodded. "Agreed on both." "That's all I need." He pushed off the doorframe. "Supper's in 20 minutes, he said, and walked back down the hall. Rosa stood in her plain little room and breathed out slowly. She'd made worse deals. The first week passed in work. Rosa was up before dawn every morning, out in the pasture checking the herd before Gideon had finished his coffee. She had a gift for it, always had. She could walk through 60 head of cattle and spot the one with a loose shoe, or an off gait, or the early signs of pink eye, before the animal even looked sick to anyone else. Gideon watched her work without comment, but she caught him paying attention. Toby followed her around like a young dog, asking questions about everything. He was 16, sharp as a tack, and had a bad leg from a childhood injury that had never set properly. He moved on his crutch with the ease of long practice. Gideon had taken him in 2 years ago, when the boy's last living relative passed, and Toby had attached himself to Bitterbutt Ridge with the particular ferocity of someone who had learned not to take shelter for granted. "How do you know that heifer's off her feed just by looking?" Toby asked one morning, watching Rosa move through the herd. "Watch her ears," Rosa said, not stopping. "See how they're angled back? She's uncomfortable." "Probably her digestion. Pull her from the main group and give her a smaller ration tonight. More water." Toby wrote it down in the little notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He wrote everything down. The nights were harder. Not for any dramatic reason. Rosa wasn't afraid of the dark or of being alone. It was just that Bitterbutt Ridge at night had its own particular quiet. And in that quiet, the weight of what she'd walked away from settled over her like a second blanket. Her father's freight office, her mother's saddle hanging on some storeroom wall, 9 years of her own labor, all of it folded into someone else's accounting books. She pushed it down and slept. The second night, she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of metal striking metal, rhythmic and low, coming from outside. She lay still and listened. It went on after a while. She got up. The forge was in a small stone building behind the main barn. Rosa wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crossed the yard, the snow crunching softly under her boots. She pushed the forge door open an inch and looked through. Gideon stood at the anvil with his back to her. He'd stripped off his shirt, and the forge fire threw orange light across the planes of his back and shoulders. He was working a piece of iron, not making anything exactly, just beating it. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, and his face, when she caught the angle of it, was tight with concentration. His arms were heavy with muscle and traced with old scars, the kind that come from things that happened once and couldn't be undone. He didn't hear her. She stood there a moment and understood without needing to be told what she was looking at. The war had been over for 15 years. For some men, it had never ended. She went back inside and came back out with a clean towel from the kitchen. She opened the forge door the rest of the way and walked in. He heard her then and spun around, iron hammer in hand, every muscle in his body coiled tight. For just a second, his eyes were somewhere else entirely, some other place, some other dark then. They cleared. He saw her. Rosa crossed the distance between them and held out the towel without a word. He looked at it. He looked at her. Slowly, the tension went out of his shoulders. He set the hammer down on the anvil and took the towel. As his hand closed around it, his fingers grazed hers. It was barely anything, a half-second of contact in a cold forge at 2 in the morning. But Rosa walked back to the cabin with her heart beating faster than it should have, and she was honest enough with herself to know exactly why. 10 days after the wedding, Gideon asked her to sit down at the table after supper. Toby was already in his bunk. The cabin was quiet. Gideon set a folded paper on the table between them. Rosa opened it. It was an official county document, the language formal and bureaucratic and grim. "Tax notice," he said. "The county sheriff issued it last week. $500 in back taxes on the valley land." Rosa looked up. "Whose land?" He didn't answer that directly. "Not yet. The notice gives 6 months. If the debt isn't cleared, the county will auction the land." He paused. "The syndicate has already filed a letter of intent to bid." "Garrett Burke's people." "Yes." Rosa set the paper down. $500. That's... She did the math quickly. At current beef prices, that was nearly 200 heads sold clean, with nothing kept back for operations. "That's everything." "Close to it." He folded his hands on the table. "I've been working scout contracts up north to cover the tax installments. It's why the cash stays thin. Every dollar I bring in goes toward keeping the collector paid." Rosa thought about that. About the cord of firewood he'd given the Henderson widow. About the thin stores in the barn. She'd thought it was just poverty. It wasn't just poverty at all. "You've been doing this alone," she said. There was nobody else. She was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 9 years. She sat with that. 9 years of keeping other people's land safe with his own labor and his own silence, and never once saying a word about it to anyone. She wanted to ask more. She had a dozen questions already forming, but his face had that closed look again, and she remembered her own rule. No partial truths. He'd given her the truth that mattered for now. The rest would come when it came. "All right," she said. "Then we've got 6 months, and we need $500. So we'd better figure out how to make it." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had just noticed someone else had put a hand under the weight. "Yes," he said. "We do." He reached across and took the tax notice back, and folded it with the same deliberate care he gave everything. Rosa picked up her coffee cup and looked at the dark window, and started thinking about cattle and money and what 6 months of hard work could build. Outside, the wind picked up off the ridge. The snow was coming again. They had a great deal of work to do. April arrived with a lie. 2 warm days at the start of the month, the kind that make a person believe the worst is over. Then, on the third night, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and the sky turned the color of an old bruise. By midnight, it was a full blizzard, wind driving hard out of the north, visibility down to 20 feet, and snow coming sideways in sheets. Rosa woke at 11 from a dead sleep. She lay still for 2 seconds, listening. Then she was up and pulling on her boots before her eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. She met Gideon in the hallway. He was already dressed, coat on, hat in hand. "The flatlands," she said. "I know. We can't leave them there." "Not in this wind." The traditional calving pasture sat in the low flat ground, along the creek bottom, sheltered from summer heat, but completely exposed to a northern gale. In normal weather, it was fine. In this weather, it was a killing ground. 40 pregnant heifers, all of them close to their time, and a wind that could drive rain and ice under a cow's hide until her core temperature dropped below saving. Gideon was already moving toward the door. "I'll wake Toby. Send him to check the water troughs first, and then come out. I don't want him in the open field until we know what we're dealing with." Rosa pulled her coat on and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of her face. "There's a sheltered shelf under Caprock Rim. I saw it when I was riding the north fence last week. It's higher ground, but the rock face blocks the northern wind dead." Gideon looked at her over the lamp he was carrying. In the warm light, his face was sharp and focused. "That's 3/4 of a mile uphill in a blizzard." "It is. And every one of those heifers will still be breathing tomorrow if we get them there." He held the lamp a moment longer. Then he turned and went to wake Toby. Moving 40 pregnant heifers uphill through a blizzard at midnight is not something that can be explained to a person who hasn't done it. The snow was knee-deep in the creek bottom, and the animals were spooked, their eyes white-rimmed in the lantern light, their breath coming in thick clouds. They didn't want to move. They wanted to bunch together and wait, which was exactly what would kill them. Rosa worked the left flank on horseback, driving the lagging animals forward with sharp yells and the snap of her reins against her leather glove. Gideon took the right flank. Toby, bless him, positioned himself at the rear with a long switch and worked it with steady, patient efficiency, never rushing the animals into panic. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of fighting wind and cold, and 4,000 pounds of confused beef cattle up a hillside that felt like it was getting steeper with every step. By the time the last heifer moved in under the rock shelf at Caprock Rim, Rosa's hands had gone numb inside her gloves, and she couldn't feel her left foot at all. But the shelf was everything she'd hoped for. The rock face rose 20 feet straight up on the north side, breaking the wind completely. Under it, the air was still and almost bearable. The heifers settled quickly, pressing together for warmth, their breathing slowing from panic to something calmer. "Count them," Rosa said, dismounting stiffly. Toby went through the herd with his lantern, lips moving. 40-1, all present. "Good boy." She was rubbing her hands together, trying to work some feeling back into her fingers, when Gideon caught her shoulder and turned her around. He was pointing to the far edge of the group. One of the young heifers, a rust-colored 2-year-old. Her first pregnancy was down on her side. Her sides were heaving in long, labored pulls. She'd been in labor before the storm hit. The stress of the drive had pushed things into crisis. Rosa was moving. Before she finished the thought, she knelt beside the heifer and ran her hands along the animal's flank, pressed her palms firmly against the belly. She'd done this before, but never in a blizzard, never with fingers that could barely feel what they were touching. She pressed her cheek against the heifer's side and waited. She felt the calf move. Wrong. The hind legs were coming first, and only one of them had turned properly. The other was folded back inside the womb. In that position, the calf couldn't come out and the heifer couldn't rest. And if it stayed that way much longer, they'd lose both of them. Rosa stripped off her heavy coat, without thinking. The cold hit her like a wall. She handed the coat to Toby without looking at him. "Hold her head," she told him. "Talk to her. Keep her calm." Toby knelt immediately at the heifer's head, one hand stroking the broad white face, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. Rosa looked at Gideon. I need you at her haunches. Hold her still. She's going to fight. He moved without a word and got his weight behind the animal's hindquarters. His big hands found purchase on the heifer's hip bones, and he braced himself in the snow. Rosa reached inside the womb and found the folded leg. It was slow, hard work, the kind of work that requires a person to stop thinking about everything. Accept the task directly in front of them. She found the bent leg and cupped the hoof in her palm and began moving it, patient and deliberate, working against the animal's contractions, waiting for the gap between them to make her move. The heifer screamed and kicked. Gideon held. Rosa kept working. Then the leg turned. Both hind hooves appeared together, and Rosa gripped them firmly and pulled with the next contraction, long and steady, leaning her whole body into it. The calf slid free in a rush and landed in the snow. It lay still for one terrible second. Rosa grabbed a handful of clean snow and rubbed the calf's face hard, clearing its nose and mouth. She rubbed its ribs. She rubbed its neck. The calf sneezed. Then it breathed. Toby made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The heifer twisted her head around immediately, her whole manner changing from exhausted agony to fierce maternal purpose, and began cleaning her calf with rough, devoted strokes of her tongue. Rosa sat back on her heels in the snow and pressed her cold hands flat against her thighs and just breathed. Gideon crouched beside her. He draped her heavy coat back around her shoulders, and she felt his hands settle it there, careful and firm. Then he didn't immediately pull away. His hands stayed at her shoulders for just a moment longer, and the warmth of them went straight through the wool. You need to get warm, he said quietly. I know. She didn't move yet. They stayed like that, both of them kneeling in the snow, watching the newborn calf try out its legs, while the storm howled beyond the rim of the rock shelf, and 40 heifers breathed steam in the lamplight around them. Gideon built a small fire from the wood they'd carried up in the supply bag. Toby fell asleep, sitting up against a boulder, his crutch across his knees, and neither adult suggested waking him. He'd earned his rest 3 times over. Rosa sat close to the fire, with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water, no coffee left, but hot water was something, and watched the newborn calf nurse for the first time. It stood on wobbling legs, ears flat, tail switching, and the heifer stood perfectly still and let it find what it needed. She heard Gideon's boots in the snow behind her. He crouched down to her level and held something out. Rosa turned to look. Her breath stopped. It was a saddle. Old leather worked smooth with years of use, the horn worn to a shine. She knew every scratch and crease in that leather. She'd grown up touching it. Her mother had ridden in it for 20 years, before arthritis took her hands. Her voice came out strange. She stopped and started again. Where did you get that? Bought it back from your father's storehouse. He said it plainly, with no drama attached. 2 weeks ago. Cost me the last of my side savings. Rosa looked at the saddle for a long moment. The firelight played over the old leather, and she could see where her mother had tied a strip of blue ribbon around the saddle strings, once years ago, and the ribbon was long gone. But you could see the faded shadow of where it had been. She reached out and took the saddle with both hands. Gideon settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. That was your last savings, she said. Yes, we have a tax debt of $500 and 6 months to raise it. Yes, and you spent your savings on a saddle. He looked at the fire. You needed it more than I needed the money. He paused. And it was yours. Rosa looked down at the old leather in her hands. She'd been through a hard day. A hard month, if she was being honest. And she was so tired, suddenly, in the way that has nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with how long a person has been holding themselves upright by sheer force of will. Her eyes filled. She didn't sob or make a scene. She just sat there with tears running down her face in the firelight, her mother's saddle in her lap, and after a moment, Gideon moved closer and put his arm around her and drew her in against his side. She leaned into him. She let herself do that much. His coat was warm, and he smelled like cedar smoke and iron and cold night air, and he held her with the quiet steadiness that was simply the way he did everything. No words, no fuss, just present. After a while, the tears stopped. The fire crackled. The calf slept beside its mother in the sheltered dark. Rosa straightened up. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said. "You saved 40 animals tonight," he said, "and one small one that might not have made it otherwise." He looked at her directly. "This ranch earned more tonight than that saddle cost. That's fair wages earned by your own hand. The calf will register under the Bar brand. Your share of this herd starts tonight." Rosa looked at him. He meant it. She could see that. Not a gift, not charity, not a man doing a woman a favor he expected to collect on later. He meant the way he meant everything plainly, and because it was right. "All right," she said. "Bar." He nodded once and turned back to the fire. Outside, the blizzard howled and threw itself against the rocks. Inside the shelter of Caprock Rim, 41 heifers and one newborn calf breathed together in the dark, and the fire burned steady, and Rosalie Mercer sat with her mother's saddle in her lap and felt, for the first time in a very long while, that she had landed somewhere solid. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Rosa drove her 22 branded steers to the mining camp alone. She'd spent 2 days selecting them, walked the herd at dawn and dusk, running her eye over each animal, the way her mother had taught her, looking at the shoulders first, then the depth of the rib cage, then the way the hindquarters sat. A steer that looked big from the side could fool you. What you wanted was depth and width together. Bone structure that carried weight, honestly. She cut 22 head that she'd have bet her life on, loaded them into the valley's shared cattle wagon in 2 trips, and drove them the 11 miles to the Halverson mining operation with nothing but Bat Tolliver's old road map and her own good sense for company. The mining foreman was a squat, skeptical man named Pruitt who looked at Rosa and then looked past her, expecting someone else to be in charge. "I'm buying beef," he said slowly, not taking advice on it. "Good," Rosa said, "because I'm selling it." She climbed down from the wagon seat and walked him through the herd herself, calling out weights from memory and explaining her selections in plain terms he could follow. She pointed to the shoulders and the ribs and the flanks, and she told him what each animal would yield in dressed weight, and she was specific enough and calm enough that Pruitt stopped, looking past her about halfway through, and started actually listening. He paid her $108 in coin. She tied the money into the inner pocket of her coat and drove the empty wagon back toward Ran Creek. The afternoon light was long and gold, and she was tired in a way that felt good, the particular satisfaction of work done well and paid fairly. She planned to stop at the saloon for a cup of coffee and a piece of whatever Mrs. Pruitt had baked that morning, which was always worth the stop. That was the plan. The Ran Creek Saloon ran a clean establishment by frontier standards. Plank floors, a long bar, 4 round tables, a stove in the corner that worked most of the time. Mrs. Oglesby served food at the bar on a chalkboard menu that changed daily. It was the kind of place where a woman could sit and eat without incident. Usually, Rosa came in and took a stool at the bar end and ordered coffee and the bean soup. She was on her 2nd cup when Garrett Burke walked in. He came in the way he always did, like a man who expected the room to rearrange itself for his comfort. He was 40, broad-chested, with a carefully trimmed beard and the clothes of a city man trying to look like a rancher. He had 3 men with him, which was always 3 more than he needed for any legitimate business. He spotted Rosa immediately. His expression shifted into something between contempt and amusement. He said it loud enough for the room to hear. "Well, rogue woman's back from the mining camp." He picked up a glass from the bar and turned it in his hand. "Selling stolen stock up at Halverson's, were you? Somebody ought to check those brands." The room went quiet, not the dramatic quiet of a dime novel, the quiet of people who don't want to be involved but can't help listening. Rosa set her coffee cup down. She turned on the bar stool and looked at Burke with the same steady focus she gave, a heifer she was about to move. Read the animal, figure out what it's actually doing. Burke was scared. She could see it under the performance. A man who'd expected to marry her and control her access to her father's freight empire, and had instead watched her disappear into a marriage he couldn't manipulate. He was covering fear with noise, same as a green steer at a new gate. She had a dozen things she could have said. She chose none of them, because from the back corner of the room, Gideon Hawk stood up. She hadn't seen him come in. He'd been sitting in the shadows near the rear wall with a cup of something, and now he rose to his full height and stepped forward into the lamplight and stopped. He didn't reach for the Winchester across his back. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, both hands visible at his sides, and looked at Garrett Burke with an expression so completely without fear or heat that it was almost worse than anger. The stillness that came off him was the stillness of a man who had once spent 6 years tracking enemy positions through hostile territory at night, and had learned that the most dangerous person in any situation is usually the quietest one. Burke's men felt it. Rosa watched them feel it, the slight shift of feet, the eyes cutting sideways. Burke held his ground for about 10 seconds. Then he set his glass down, said something to his men about having better places to be, and walked out. The room exhaled. Gideon crossed to the bar and sat down on the stool beside Rosa. He picked up her coffee cup, turned it slightly to check if it was empty, and signaled Mrs. Oglesby for 2 more. "You didn't have to do that," Rosa said. "I know." He accepted the fresh cup. "I wanted to," it was simply stated, and she believed him. And that was the end of it. They drank their coffee and ate the bean soup side by side, and Rosa told him about the mining camp sale and the $108, and Gideon listened the way he listened to everything completely, without interrupting. They rode home together in the late afternoon, Gideon on his roan gelding, and Rosa on the borrowed bay that had become her regular mount since her father had kept her own horse. The valley road was dry and the horses moved at an easy walk, not hurrying. It was Rosa who found it. She was mending Gideon's coat that evening, a tear along the left shoulder seam that had been getting worse for 2 weeks when her needle caught on something inside the lining. She reached into the inner pocket and pulled out 2 things. The first was an antique iron key, heavy and old, the kind made for a serious lock. The ring was worn smooth, as if it had been handled often. The second was a folded paper. She opened it carefully. A survey map, hand-drawn and precise, with measurements marked along every boundary line. She didn't recognize all the landmarks, but she recognized the general shape of the valley. She turned the key over in her palm. It was warm from being inside the coat. Gideon came in from checking the horses and stopped when he saw what she was holding. Something moved across his face, not alarm exactly, but a careful attention. Rosa held up the key. "What does this open?" He crossed the room and held out his hand. She placed the key in it. His fingers closed around it, and he stood there a moment, not looking at her. "I'll explain it when I can," he said. "Not yet." Rosa looked at the survey map still in her other hand. Then at him. "You said, 'No partial truths.' I know what I said." He met her eyes. "I'm not lying to you, Rosa. There are things that involve other people in this valley, not just me. When I can explain it without putting anyone at risk, I will." He paused. "You have my word." She held his gaze long enough to be sure she believed him. She did, reluctantly, and with a mental note to come back to it. But she did. She folded the map and handed it back. He tucked both items into his shirt pocket, closer than the coat lining, and she returned to mending the coat and didn't ask again. That night she thought about the key for a long time before she fell asleep. They left for home in the soft last light of the afternoon. The road back to Bitterbutt Ridge crossed the open valley floor, miles of grassland going amber in the low sun, the mountains turning purple at the edges. The sky was enormous and clear, and so full of stars by the time they reached the midpoint that Rosa had pulled her horse to a slow walk just to look at it. Gideon slowed to match her. He'd been riding beside her in comfortable silence for a while when he said, "Give me the reins a moment." She glanced over. He'd brought his roan in close alongside her bay, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. She handed him the reins without argument. Curious. He shifted behind her on his horse. No, not behind her. He'd drawn his roan so close that when he reached across and took her hands and placed them on the reins again, it was almost like sitting together. His arms came around from behind, not holding her, just framing her hands with his. His chin was near her temple. "Look up," he said. "Find the two brightest stars in the northern sky." She looked up. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a great pale wash, and in the north, two stars burned steadier and brighter than everything around them. "I see them. That's Polaris, the North Star, second one over from the end of the Little Dipper's handle." His voice was low and close. On a cloudy night with no landmarks, that star is the only fixed point in the sky. Everything else rotates around it. If you know where it is, you always know which way is north. His hands guided hers very slightly on the reins, a small adjustment. "Feel that? Your horse tracks straighter when you hold even pressure on both sides. You're favoring the left hand slightly." "I do that when I'm tired," she admitted. "Even pressure," he said. Again, and his thumb moved briefly across her knuckles to show her. "Let the horse feel it equal," she adjusted. The bay's head came up a fraction, and his stride smoothed out. They rode like that for a while, his arms a loose frame around her in the dark, the horses walking together in the grass. The stars turned slowly overhead. Rosa could feel the warmth of him at her back and the steadiness of his presence, and she was aware, very aware, that she was not in any hurry to put more distance between them. She didn't know who moved first. She'd wonder about that later, and never quite settle it. But at some point, she turned her head, and he was already looking down at her, and the space between them closed without any drama at all. His mouth was warm. The kiss was careful at first, and then it wasn't. His hand came up and touched the side of her jaw, and she turned more fully toward him, and the horses walked on steadily beneath them, unbothered and patient. When they finally separated, neither of them said anything for a long moment. The valley spread around them, dark and wide. The North Star burned steadily overhead, exactly where he'd said it would be. "Even pressure," Rosa said quietly. She felt rather than heard him laugh a low, brief thing surprised out of him. She faced forward and took the reins back properly and kept riding, and Gideon rode at her side all the way home, and neither of them mentioned the kiss again that night. They didn't need to. Some things are understood without being named. The coal mine shut down on a Tuesday, with no warning and very little explanation. A notice went up on the Halverson Company board saying operations were suspended, pending a review of the eastern shaft. 240 men put down their tools and came home to families that had been planning on another 6 months of wages. The news moved through Rand Creek Valley, like water through cracked ground fast, and in every direction at once. 3 days later, the hailstorm came. It lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the valley's hay fields looked like someone had beaten them with boards. The standing crop that the homesteaders had been counting on to feed their animals through early summer was flattened and black, the stalks broken at the base. The seed heads gone to mush. Rosa walked one of the ruined fields with Gideon the morning after, and neither of them said much because there wasn't much useful to say. 7 of the 11 valley families had no stored reserves. They'd sold off their winter hay surplus in February when the prices were good and the mine was still running. And things had looked, briefly, like they were improving. The animals had to eat. That meant buying hay, and buying hay meant spending money. Nobody had. Within a week, Ephraim Mercer and Garrett Burke arrived in the valley with wagons. They set up at the old Miller property and started buying. $2.50 a head, cash on the spot, no negotiations. For a family staring at an empty hay barn and hungry cattle, and no mine wages coming, $2.50 a head looked like something. It wasn't. Market rate was $11 in Dodge City. 250 was a rescue that was actually a theft, dressed up as generosity. Rosa watched two families sell in the first 3 days. Good people. People she'd come to know through the winter, the Breckenridge family with their 5 kids. Old Mr. Parson, who'd been working his quarter section for 20 years. They shook hands with Burke's men and looked relieved, and Rosa could barely stand to watch because the relief was real, but the math was devastating. She started making rounds. Every morning before her own work, she rode to a different homestead and sat at someone's kitchen table and talked through the numbers. She wasn't gentle about it. 250 a head, she said at the Hayes widow's kitchen table. You've got 30 head of cattle. That's $75. You know what 30 head sells for in Dodge City right now? Mrs. Cordelia Hayes was a small, tired woman in her 50s who'd been running her homestead alone since her husband died the previous spring. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at Rosa with eyes that wanted to believe there was another option. $330, Rosa said. That's the difference between what Burke's offering you and what your cattle are actually worth. That difference is $255. That's almost a year's worth of a working man's wages. I can't drive cattle to Dodge City alone, Mrs. Hayes said. You won't be alone, Rosa said. She didn't have the full plan yet, but she said it like she did. The town meeting was called for the last Friday of the month. It was held in the Ran Creek feed store, which was the largest indoor space in the valley capable of holding the number of people who needed to be there. Rosa came with Gideon. Bat Tolliver came. Most of the valley families came. Ephraim Mercer came too, which she should have expected. He stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and the particular look on his face that Rosa had known since childhood, the expression of a man who believes he is the most practical person in any room and is mildly impatient with everyone else for not seeing it. The meeting started with the practical problems, which were considerable. 6 families were down to 30 days of feed. 3 more had 30 to 60 days. The math of the valley's survival was laid out on a chalkboard by the feed store owner, and it was not encouraging. Rosa stood up and started to talk about the cattle drive idea. She'd been working it out for a week, the basic shape of it, the road brand concept, combining the valley herds. She was 3 minutes in when Ephraim spoke. Before we discuss speculative plans, he said, not unkindly, which was how he always said the cruelest things, there's something this valley ought to know. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. I had a title search done on the valley land last month, out of my own concern for these families. The room went still. Rosa's eyes moved to Gideon. He was standing at the side wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. The deed records show, Ephraim said, opening the document, that all 41 sections of Ran Creek Valley have been held in single legal ownership for the past 9 years. He looked up. By Gideon Hawk. The room erupted. Not violently. In the particular way of small communities where a revelation touches every person present, overlapping voices, chairs scraping, people turning to look at Gideon with expressions ranging from confusion to fury. Rosa stood perfectly still. She thought about the iron key, the survey map, 9 years, every penny going to the tax collector, all those scouting jobs up north. He'd known. He'd known the whole time, and he'd never said a word. She thought about what it would have meant to these families if it had come out differently, if Gideon had announced his ownership 9 years ago. Every one of these homesteaders would have become a tenant farmer overnight, or been pushed off their land entirely. He hadn't done that. He'd done the opposite. She knew that. She understood it clearly. And she still felt the floor shift under her. Her father watched her face with the precise attention of a man who had engineered the moment to produce exactly this effect. She picked up her saddlebag from the floor beside her chair and walked out. She was saddling the bay in the feed store's side lot when she heard Gideon's boots behind her. Rosa. Not right now, I understand. He stopped at a respectful distance. But there are men riding for the ridge tonight. Burke's night riders. Bat just got word from the telegraph office. She turned around. His face was level and serious. No deflection, no performance, just the facts. How soon? She said. 2 hours, maybe less. She looked at him for a long moment. There was so much she wanted to say, and none of it was suited to the next 2 hours. She let it go for now. Toby's at the ridge, she asked. Yes. Then let's go. They rode hard and made it back to Bitterbit Ridge in under an hour. The night was clear and cold, and Rosa could smell the air changing something electrical in it. The particular charge that meant trouble was coming. Gideon sent Toby to move the horses to the stone-walled paddock at the north end of the property, while he and Rosa loaded rifles and took positions at the front of the main cabin. Bat Tulliver arrived 20 minutes later on a lathered horse with his own shotgun and the grim-focused expression of a man who'd ridden through worse. They waited. The night riders came at 2 in the morning, 6 of them coming up from the south trail with their faces covered and their torches already lit. The hay barn went first. The fire took hold so fast it was clear they'd used something to help it along kerosene from the smell of it. The north wall of the barn was a sheet of flame within 90 seconds, and the roar of it was enormous in the dark valley night. Gideon was already moving before Rosa had fully registered what was happening. He ran directly toward the burning barn. Gideon! She was up and moving after him. Toby's in there! He shouted back. And the bull! Rosa spun to Bat. Keep them off the cabin! Bat was already bringing his shotgun up. The first crack of it split the night, and one of the riders wheeled away. Rosa pulled her own rifle and laid down covering fire from the porch, not aiming to kill, but aiming to make 6 men on horseback believe that staying in her line of sight was a poor decision. Most of them scattered back. 2 didn't. Bullets hit the porch railing, hit the cabin wall. Rosa moved fast and low, repositioning between shots, keeping them guessing about where she was. She'd never done this before, not like this, not with people actually shooting back. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. Her mind was clear in the way that extreme focus sometimes produces. Everything narrowed down to the next movement, the next shot, the next second. Inside the burning barn, she could hear Gideon shouting. Then she heard Toby's voice answering. Then the massive, panicked bellow of the breeding bull. The south wall of the barn collapsed inward in a cascade of burning timber. Then the barn's main door blew outward, and Toby came through it on his crutch, moving faster than Rosa had ever seen him move, the bull on a lead rope behind him, the animal wild-eyed and terrified, and coming anyway, because Toby had its lead wrapped around his good arm and refused to let go. Behind them, 3 seconds later, came Gideon. His left shoulder was wrong. She could see it from 20 feet away, the angle of it wrong, something broken or dislocated. His shirt was burning along the left sleeve, and he beat it out with his right hand as he cleared the door. He was bleeding from his ribs, where a bullet had grazed, through the fabric of his coat, a dark wet line across his left side. He got 6 steps from the burning barn and went down. Rosa was off the porch and across the yard before Bat had time to shout her name. She dropped to her knees in the blood-stained snow beside her husband, one hand going to his chest, feeling for his breathing. He was breathing. His eyes were open. He looked at her with pain and clarity mixed together. The iron key had slipped from his coat pocket in the fall. It lay in the snow between them, catching the orange light of the burning barn. Rosa's hand closed around it without thinking. Above them, the burning barn roared and sent a column of sparks up into the cold black sky. Gunfire still cracked from the dark, beyond the fence line. Bat's shotgun answered from the porch. "Don't you dare," Rosa said to Gideon. Her voice came out fierce and low. "Don't you dare?" He looked up at her. His right hand found her arm and gripped it. "Still here," he said. She pressed her hand harder against the wound at his ribs and looked up at the fire and the dark and thought clearly, with the part of her mind that never stopped working, no matter what. He'd kept an entire valley safe for 9 years in silence and nearly died in a burning barn, and she was still angry at him, and she was also, without any question, not going anywhere. Both things were true. She held them both, and stayed exactly where she was. The bullet fragments had to come out that same night. Rosa knew it the moment she got Gideon inside and cut away his shirt by lamplight. The graze along his ribs had gone deeper than it looked from outside. Not a clean furrow, but a jagged where the bullet had skipped off the second rib and left metal behind. His left shoulder was dislocated, the joint sitting visibly wrong, the whole arm already swelling dark. She looked at Bat. Bat looked at her. Doc Hennessy's in Clarendon. 6 hours round trip. He won't make 6 hours with metal in his ribs. Rosa was already rolling up her sleeves. Boil water. Find me the smallest knife in the kitchen drawer, the one with the narrow blade. And whiskey not for him yet. For sterilizing, Bat didn't argue. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize when a person knew what they were doing. Toby sat in the corner with the bull's lead rope still wrapped around his wrist, not because the bull was there anymore, but because he hadn't noticed he was still holding it. He was white-faced and shaking slightly, the particular aftermath of a body that had been running on pure emergency and was now coming down from it. "Toby," Rosa said, without looking up from laying out her instruments. "The bull is in the stone paddock?" "Yes, ma'am. Good. You did well tonight. Go wash your hands, and then come hold the lamp for me. I need steady light, and you've got..." It gave him something to do, which was what he needed. He unwrapped the rope from his wrist and moved. Gideon was conscious on the table and tracking everything with his eyes. His jaw was set, and his right hand gripped the table edge, but he didn't make a sound when Rosa cleaned the wound with whiskey-soaked cloth. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know. I'll be as fast as I can." "I know that, too." His eyes met hers. "I trust you." She worked by lamplight for the better part of an hour. Toby held the lamp without wavering. Bat stood at the foot of the table and kept pressure on the rib wound, while Rosa worked the narrow blade in to find and extract 2 fragments of flattened lead, each one smaller than her thumbnail, but each one capable of killing a man slowly from infection if left inside. She found them both. She cleaned the cavity as thoroughly as she could and packed it with clean cloth and bound it tight. The shoulder was harder. Resetting a dislocated joint requires leverage and speed, and a certain willingness to do something that looks and sounds terrible in order to prevent something worse. Rosa had watched a ranch hand's shoulder reset once, years ago, and she'd paid attention, because she'd always paid attention to things that might matter later. She gave Gideon the whiskey for this part. He took 2 long pulls and handed it back and looked at the ceiling. "On 3, Rosa said. She positioned herself, got her grip right, braced her knee against the table edge for leverage. 1. She did it on 2. Fast and complete, the joint going back with a sound she felt in her back teeth. Gideon's whole body went rigid. A sound came out of him that was mostly breath, forced out through clenched teeth. Then he went slack. "It's in," Rosa said. Rest. He was asleep in 4 minutes. His body simply gave up and took what it needed. Rosa sat in the chair beside the table and looked at her hands, which were finally, now that the work was done, shaking slightly. Bat put a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table. "He's going to be fine," he said. "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I know he is." Outside, the burned barn sent a thin column of smoke up into the pre-dawn sky. The night riders were long gone. Somewhere in the dark, Burke's men were reporting back to someone, and somewhere in the valley, her father was sleeping in a hotel bed and thinking he'd won something tonight. Rosa drank her coffee and watched Gideon breathe and thought about the iron key, which was still in her coat pocket. The fever came the next morning and stayed for 3 days. It wasn't unexpected. The body's response to trauma and infection follows its own timeline, regardless of what anyone prefers. Rosa knew this and prepared for it. She kept the wound clean and changed the packing twice a day, which was unpleasant for both of them. She kept water and broth going into him on a regular schedule, coaxing him awake enough to swallow and then letting him rest again. Toby ran the cattle operations alone during those 3 days, with Bat riding out morning and evening to check on him. The boy managed better than anyone had a right to expect. He kept the feeding schedule, checked the water troughs, moved the herd to the east pasture. On his own judgment, when the south field got muddy. When Rosa told him he'd done well, he shrugged in the way of someone trying not to look too pleased and went back to work. On the second night of the fever, Gideon's dreams came up bad. Rosa was sitting in the chair beside his bed when it started the rigid stillness first, which she'd learned to watch for, and then the low sounds and the hands gripping the blanket. She leaned forward and put her hand firmly on his forearm. Gideon. Her voice was calm and clear. You're at Bitterbutt Ridge. You're in your own bed. It's night, and it's quiet, and you're safe. His breathing changed. The grip on the blanket loosened slightly. Hear the wind, she said. That's just the ridge wind. Nothing else. He came back slowly. The way people do from those particular dreams in stages, the body reluctant to give up its alarm. His eyes opened and found her face, and she watched the recognition come. Rosa, he said. His voice was rough from fever and sleep. Right here, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I hate that you see this. I know. She didn't tell him it was fine or that it didn't matter, because he was an intelligent man who would know those were comfortable lies. It doesn't change anything, she said instead, which was the truth. He was quiet for a while. The fever was still high enough that she kept the wet cloth on his forehead and replaced it twice. Outside the window, the valley was dark and still. Then he started talking. Not because she pushed him. She hadn't asked about the key or the land or anything else since the night of the fire. He simply reached a point, somewhere in that quiet dark room, with the fever burning through him and his defenses reduced to what was actually true, where the story had been held in too long. In 1878, he said, staring at the ceiling, I was working scout contracts for the Western Land Improvement Company. 6 years of contracts. Dangerous. Work mapping hostile territory. Running communications through areas where that could get a man killed. He paused. When the company went bankrupt, they had no cash to settle the back wages they owed me. 6 years of back pay. Another pause, so they gave me the land deeds instead. All 41 sections of Rand Creek Valley. Rosa sat still and listened. By the time I got here with those deeds, 11 families were already settled on the land, had been for years. They'd built homes here. They'd buried people here. He turned his head and looked at her. If I'd walked in and announced I held the title, every one of them would have become a tenant farmer at best. More likely, they'd have been pushed off entirely. So you didn't announce it, Rosa said. I burned the announcement, told myself I'd figure out another way. His jaw tightened. The taxes were already accruing. The previous company had let them go for 2 years before they went under. I started paying them out of my own pocket. Took every dangerous job I could find to keep the payments current. Rosa looked at him. 9 years of dangerous scouting contracts. 9 years of thin living. 9 years of watching his neighbors prosper on land he legally owned, and never saying a word. And the only person he'd ever kept it from was the county tax assessor, who simply received his payments and recorded them without asking how the money was earned. You could have told someone, she said. One person. It wouldn't have had to be everyone. If one person knew, eventually everyone would know. That's how things work in a valley this size. He looked back at the ceiling, and once it was known, Burke's people would have moved faster. The syndicate's been watching this valley for years. The only thing protecting these families was that there was no clear legal title to contest. Rosa sat with that for a moment. The logic was sound. It was also lonely as anything she'd ever heard. The key, she said, opens the county land office. I have the deed box held there under a third-party name. A precaution. He reached slowly under his pillow with his good arm and produced the iron key, holding it out to her. You should have it, in case something happens to me. She took it. The metal was warm from being under the pillow. She turned it over in her palm. Nothing's going to happen to you, she said. She closed her fingers around the key and set it on the bedside table where they could both see it. He looked at her for a long moment. The fever had made his eyes bright, and the honesty of exhaustion had stripped everything else away. And what was left was simply a man who had been carrying something enormous for 9 years and had just set it down. Rosa leaned forward and rested her forehead briefly against his. Her free hand covered his on the blanket. He turned his hand under hers and held on. She wept then, quietly and briefly, pressed against him, not for sadness, but for the sheer weight of what he'd been and done in silence, and for the strange grace of being the person he'd finally told. When she straightened up, his thumb moved across her knuckles. She looked at him. He looked at her. Everything that had been building since a snow-dusted dusk, when he caught her off a borrowed mule, was present in that look, clear and unavoidable. She stayed. Later, she would think that love is not a single moment, but a series of recognitions, each one smaller and more certain than the last. Until you arrive somewhere, you realize you've been moving toward for a long time. This was one of those recognitions. She stayed through the fever and through the night, and into the gray morning, and when the fever finally broke near dawn on the third day, and Gideon slept the deep, quiet sleep of genuine rest, Rosa sat beside him and listened to the ridge wind and felt, with complete clarity, that her life had divided itself into before and after, and she was on the right side of the line. Human dignity and silent sacrifice. She turned the words over in her mind without speaking them. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. What Gideon had done for 11 families, for 9 years, with no witness and no reward, that was the measure of a man. Not his wages or his acreage or what anybody called him in town. What a person does when nobody's looking. That's the measure. Rosa spread the plan on the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after Gideon's fever broke. A hand-drawn map. All 11 valley properties marked. Estimated head counts beside each one. A line drawn north from Rand Creek Valley to Dodge City, following the established cattle trail with the water crossings marked in red. Gideon stood across the table from her. His left arm was still in a sling, the shoulder healing, but not healed, and he'd lost some weight during the fever. He studied the map with the focused quiet of someone doing real arithmetic in their head. 2,200 head, Rosa said. Combined from all 11 families. Road branded together under a single mark for the drive, so there's no question of disputed ownership in transit. She put her finger on the northern endpoint. Dodge City is paying $11 a head right now. That's $24,200. If we sell clean. Gideon looked up. The tax debt is $500, Rosa continued. We pay it off the top the moment we're back. The rest gets distributed to the families proportional to the head count they contributed. She met his eyes. Every family in this valley goes from starving to solvent in 23 days. He was quiet for a moment. 2,200 head is a large drive. You need experienced hands. Bat can trail boss the logistics. I know these animals. I know which families have which cattle and how they move. She paused. I need you to talk to the homesteaders. They'll say yes to you faster than they'll say yes to me. He looked at the map again, at his left arm in the sling, then back at her. With this arm, I can't lead a drive, he said. It wasn't complaint, just facts, I know. Rosa held his gaze. I'm not asking you to lead it. I'm leading it. She let that sit for a moment. I'm asking you to ride drag. Drag was the rear position of a cattle drive. The dustiest, most thankless place on a trail, riding at the back of 2,000 head, eating the dust of every animal in front of you, pushing the slow ones forward. It was traditionally where you put the greenest hands, or the men being punished for something. She was asking the man who owned 41 sections of valley land to ride drag under her command. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close to one. All right, he said. It took 4 days to bring all 11 families into agreement. Some of them were easy. The Hayes widow said yes before Rosa had finished explaining the plan. Both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, eyes sharp with calculation. The Breckenridge family took an afternoon of conversation, but came around. 3 of the other families needed to see the math written out before they believed it. So, Rosa wrote it out. The last holdout was old Mr. Parson, who'd already sold 40 head to Burke's men and was feeling the particular shame of a man who'd taken a bad deal and knew it. Rosa sat across from him at his kitchen table and didn't mention the Burke sale. "You have 62 head left," she said. "At $11 a head in Dodge, that's $682. That's enough to rebuild your hay stores, fix your north fence, and have money remaining." Parson looked at his hands. "I'm 64 years old. I don't drive cattle. You don't have to. Your cattle come under our road brand for the drive. Your obligation is to sign the agreement and let your hired hand bring the animals to the gather point." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Parson, you've worked that quarter section for 20 years. Don't let Burke take the rest of it for $250 a head when the market says 11. He was quiet for a long time. $682, he said finally. "That's the number." He picked up the pen. The gather took 2 days. 2,214 head of mixed cattle, assembled on the flat ground at the valley's north end, road branded with a simple RCV mark burned clean and clear on each animal's left hip. Rosa rode the perimeter of the herd for 3 hours on the morning of departure, reading the animals, sorting in her mind which groups would be difficult, which steers had the pace to set the front, which cows were likely to drift. Bat Tolliver rode up beside her on his old gray horse. He had his canvas duster on, and his hat pulled low and looked like exactly what he was, a man who had driven cattle and stagecoaches and wagons across half of the frontier and was not particularly impressed by any of it. "You've got 3 anxious steers in the northeast corner of the herd that are going to cause problems at the first water crossing," he said. "I see them. Put Hendricks on their left shoulder from the start. He's got a quiet horse that doesn't spook them." Bat nodded. "Who do you want at point?" "Martinez. He knows this trail north. I'll ride swing on the right, and you take the left." She glanced back at the trailing edge of the herd, where Gideon was already in position on his roan, one-handed, his left arm strapped close to his body. The dust back there would be considerable. "Check on him every 2 hours. He won't thank me for it. Check on him anyway." They moved out at first light on a Tuesday. The first 8 days were hard in the ordinary ways that cattle drives are hard. Long hours in the saddle. Animals that drifted or balked at creek crossings. One night of rain that turned the trail to mud and made the morning's first 5 miles feel like 20. A steer that broke from the herd on day 4 and led Rosa on a 40-minute chase through scrub brush before she got a rope on him. The herd moved well overall. Rosa had been right about Martinez. At point, he kept the lead animals at a pace the whole herd could sustain without tiring, which was the essential skill of a good point rider. Too fast, and you burn the cattle out. Too slow, and the rear of the herd bunches up and animals start riding over each other. She rode long hours. She ate in the saddle most days. At night, she sat by the cook fire and went through the head counts Bat kept and did the mental math on their progress and their timing. She slept 4 to 5 hours and was up again before the Wranglers. Gideon came to the fire late, on the 9th night. He sat beside her, his left arm still in its sling, his face and coat powdered gray with 200 head worth of trail dust. He looked exhausted and completely present, the way he always did. "How's the shoulder?" she asked. "Manageable." He poured himself coffee and looked at the map she had across her knees. "We're 2 days out from the Canadian River. Yes, Burke knows where we are. He's had men tracking the herd since we left the valley." She looked at him. "How long have you known that?" 3 days. Bat spotted them first. 2 riders, hanging back far enough to watch, but not engage. His eyes were steady. "They're not following to observe. They're scouting the crossing point, the Canadian River. Spring runoff would have it high and fast. A herd of 2,000 head funneled into a river crossing was the most vulnerable it would ever be, strung out over a quarter mile of churning water. The riders spread thin trying to keep animals from drowning in the current. If Burke was going to hit them, that was when and where. Rosa rolled up the map. We need to change the crossing point. I already identified an alternative. 2 miles east. Shallower, wider, better banks for that many animals. He drew the adjustment in the dirt beside the fire with a stick. It adds half a day to our route. Worth it. Yes, he paused. There's one more thing. If they do hit us at the crossing, they'll be shooting over water. The crossing will be chaos, regardless. Animals, panicking, current, noise. He looked at her directly. You stay out of the water. Command from the bank. Rosa looked at him. And if the lead steers start back across, then I'll turn them. You're riding one-handed. I've been riding one-handed for 9 days, she held his gaze. If I need to go in the water to keep this herd moving, I'm going in. He didn't like it. She could see that. But he was also, she'd come to understand this, about him a man who respected the decisions of people who had earned the right to make them. Stay upstream of the main body, he said finally. The current is strongest midstream. If your horse stumbles, you'll have more time to recover. Agreed. They sat by the dying fire for another hour, shoulders touching, the dark prairie stretching out around them in every direction. The cattle were bedded down, and the night wranglers moved slow circles around them. Their horses, walking quietly in the dark, Rose's head drifted sideways and came to rest against Gideon's good shoulder. He didn't move or comment. Just let her rest there, his free hand moving to her arm to keep the cold off. In the morning, she'd change the crossing route and position the riders and be ready for whatever Burke's men brought to that riverbank. Right now, she let herself have this 10 minutes of stillness. In the middle of something hard, her husband's shoulder solid under her cheek. The sound of 2,000 cattle breathing in the dark. The ambush came on the 12th day at the Canadian River, which was running high and brown and fast from the spring melt, even at the alternative crossing point. They were halfway across 1,200 head on the far bank, 1,000 still coming through when the shots started. They came from the tree line on the south bank, 6 or 7 rifles firing at once. The front of the herd on the far shore exploded into movement, the lead steers wheeling in panic, driving back toward the water. 3 riders on the north bank went scrambling to turn them. Rosa was midstream on the bay when it started. The horse lurched sideways at the sound of the first shot, and she had half a second to decide between pulling up and pushing through. She pushed through, driving the horse forward with her legs, leaning into the current. She came up on the north bank at a dead run and drove straight into the turning herd, angling in from the side, pushing the lead steers with her horse's shoulder, cutting them away from the water's edge. Her voice was loud and continuous, the commanding shout that cattle respond to when everything else is noise, and she stayed in their eye line and kept pushing until the turn broke. And the lead animals committed to going forward instead of back. Behind her, in the river, and on the south bank, she could hear the precise, unhurried crack of Gideon's Winchester. Not rapid fire, not panic. The measured pace of a man who had been the best shot in his army unit for 6 years and had not forgotten anything. She heard Burke's men shout, heard horses scatter. The shooting from the tree line lost its rhythm, became sporadic, became individual. Then it stopped. She kept the lead steers moving north until the herd was fully committed, and the drag riders had the rear animals up the bank and moving. Then she turned the bay around and looked back at the river. Gideon was on the south bank, rifle across his saddle, watching the tree line. His roan stood perfectly still under him. On the ground at the edge of the trees, she could see 2 horses without riders, and 1 man sitting with his hands visible, and that was all she needed to know. The river ran brown and fast between them. Rosa turned back to the herd and kept it moving north. That night they made camp early, and Rosa counted heads twice, and came up with 2,192. 22 head lost in the crossing panic, a painful number, and a far better one than it could have been. Gideon found her at the cook fire after the count. He was dusty and tired, and his left arm was hurting. She could tell by how carefully he moved it. He sat down beside her, and she leaned forward and put her hand on the side of his face, just briefly, and he turned into it for a moment, like a man who has been very far from warmth for a very long time. 22 head, she said. We still have 2,192 at $11. She did the math. $24,112. Enough, he said. More than enough. They sat together while the camp settled around them, the cattle grazing in the dusk, the cook fire burning low. Dodge City, 11 days north, and every reason in the world to keep going. They came into Dodge City on a Thursday afternoon, 23 days out of Rand Creek Valley. 2,192 head of cattle, walking in a long, dusty column down the approach road to the stockyards. Rosa rode point. She'd moved up to the front of the herd on the last day, partly for practical reasons, and partly because she needed to see Dodge City before Dodge City saw her. The town rose up from the Kansas plain, like an argument, noise, and smoke, and the constant low roar of a place where a great deal of money changed hands every day, and almost nobody was sentimental about how. The stockyards sat at the south end of Front Street, a maze of board fences and loading chutes and holding pens that could process 10,000 head on a busy week. The smell reached them half a mile out. The sound reached them sooner. Cattle already penned, the clang of gates, men shouting over the din. Bat rode up beside Rosa as they came in. Buyers are at the north of the yards. Bates has the largest operation. Out of Chicago. I know who Bates is. He's not easy. Bat looked at her sideways. You want me to open the conversation? No, Rosa said. I don't. She squared her shoulders and kept riding. They got the herd penned in 3 hours. It was good work, clean and efficient, and the yard hands who helped them run the animals through the gates watched Rosa call positions and adjustments with the particular attention of men who know their business well enough to recognize when someone else does too. Then the telegrams hit. A yard hand brought the news to Bat, who brought it to Rosa without ceremony. Ephraim Mercer had been sending wires to every major buyer in Dodge for the past week. The language was measured and lawyerly, and devastating. The herd was under disputed ownership. The drive was led by an unqualified woman with no legal standing in the transaction. Any purchase contract would be subject to immediate challenge. He'd sent the same wire to 4 buyers. 3 of them had already declined to meet. Rosa stood in the stockyard dust and read the telegram twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Gideon found her 20 minutes later, standing at the fence of the main holding pen, watching their cattle. He leaned on the rail beside her and said nothing for a moment. He got to the buyers, she said. I heard. 3 of them won't meet. There's one he didn't get to, Gideon said, or one who didn't care. He nodded toward the north end of the yards, where a heavy-set man in a dark wool coat was moving through the pens with 2 men behind him, stopping at intervals to look at cattle with the practiced eye of someone who'd been doing it for 30 years. Bates. Rosa watched him. He moved like a man who had won most of his arguments and expected to win the rest. He'll try something, she said. It wasn't a question, probably. She pushed off the fence. Good. I work better when people try something. Bates saw her coming and made no effort to pretend he hadn't. He was 60, thick through the chest, with a gray beard cut short and eyes that were a flat, assessing blue. He looked at Rosa the way he probably looked at cattle, with professional interest and no particular warmth. Mrs. Hawk, he said. He'd done his homework. I got your drive numbers from the yard register. 2,200 head, give or take. 2,192, Rosa said. Not give or take. One corner of his mouth moved. I also got a wire from a man named Mercer saying I shouldn't touch this herd. Ephraim Mercer is my father. He's not a party to this transaction. Rosa kept her voice even. The cattle are legally branded and documented. The bill of sale records are complete. I can put the paperwork in your hands in 20 minutes. Paperwork's paperwork. He looked past her at the pens. What I can't verify from a wire is whether the woman running this drive actually knows what she's doing, or whether she got lucky for 240 miles. Rosa looked at him. Then verify it. Bates glanced at the man on his left, who was younger and wearing the look of someone used to managing awkward moments on his employer's behalf. Then he looked back at Rosa. You know what a squeeze chute is? I've worked squeeze chutes since I was 12. He pointed to the working pen at the north end of the yards, where the chute machinery stood a narrow metal channel with a head gate at the end, used for processing individual animals. At the far end of the working pen, a large red longhorn bull stood in the holding area, maybe 1,600 pounds of bad temperament and wide horns, the kind of animal that the yard hands gave a respectful amount of space. Step in the chute with that bull, Bates said. If you can handle him, I'll listen to your price. The men behind him were quiet. A few of the yard hands nearby had stopped what they were doing. Rosa looked at the bull. He was watching her already, his head low, eyes tracking at. She'd read enough animals to know what she was looking at. He wasn't mean, not essentially. He was stressed and overstimulated from 3 days in a loud yard, and he was showing it the only way he knew how, with size and noise and the threat of movement. She handed her coat to Bat, who had appeared at her shoulder at some point without being summoned. She rolled up her sleeves. She walked to the chute gate and let herself in and closed it behind her. The bull shifted his weight immediately. Rosa moved slowly and directly toward him, not at his head and not at his flank, but at the angle that livestock read as non-threatening the shoulder approach. Body turned slightly sideways. No sudden movements. She kept her breathing steady. She kept her eyes soft, not staring him down, just present. She got close enough to touch him, and she put her bare hand on the broad flat of his muzzle. He pushed against her palm once, hard, testing. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just held her hand there and let him feel that she was neither going away nor going to harm him. And after a moment, the muscles across his massive neck began to ease. The bull stood still. The yard was very quiet. Rosa turned to the gate and nodded to the yard hands standing there. Bring me 10 steers from the RCV pens. Random selection. Your choice, not mine. They brought 10 steers through one at a time and ran them along the scale. Before each animal stepped on the platform, Rosa called a number. She called all 10 without hesitation, without squinting at the animal, or feeling its sides, or doing anything visible except looking at it with the same focused attention she'd been giving cattle since she was old enough to walk through a herd. The yardmaster read the scale after each one and called it out loud. The first steer, Rosa called 910 pounds. Scale said 897. 13-pound margin. Second, and 40 called 1,028 on the scale. Third through 10th followed the same way. Not one of her estimates was more than 15 pounds off what the scale said. On 3 of the animals, she was within 4 pounds. The crowd around the pen had grown. 100 men, maybe more, standing along the fence rails, watching without speaking. Bates stared at the scale results. Then he looked at Rosa. Where did you learn that? He said. My mother taught me to look at shoulders and depth together, Rosa said. My father used my skill for 9 years without paying me fairly for it. I'm here now because I paid myself. She held his gaze. $11 a head, 2,192 head. You're looking at $24,112 worth of documented, legally branded cattle from 11 Rand Creek Valley families who drove them here themselves. Bates was quiet for a moment. $11, he said. That's the market rate. You know it and I know it. He looked at the pen where the RCV cattle stood. He looked at the scale results in his yard master's hand. He looked at Rosa. 12, he said, which was not what she'd expected. She kept her face still. Done. Bates put out his hand and she shook it, and the 100 men along the fence rails let out a sound that was not quite a cheer, but was close enough. $26,304. In gold. Rosa stood in the yard master's office 2 hours later while they counted it out. and tried to do the arithmetic of what that meant for 11 families in Rand Creek Valley and couldn't quite make it feel real. She was very tired, and her hands still smelled like longhorn bull, and she didn't care about either of those things at all. Gideon was waiting outside when she came out. He looked at her face and didn't need to ask. $12 a head, she said. Something in his expression broke open, briefly, before he got it back under control. He reached out and took her hand. She let him hold it, and they stood there in the stockyard dust while Dodge City went about its loud, indifferent business around them. That night, Burke made his move. Gideon wasn't sleeping when it started. He'd been watching from the window of the rooming house they'd taken, near the yards, watching the street and the yard perimeter with the patience of someone who has spent a long time learning that trouble announces itself if you pay attention. When he saw the first man with a torch moving along the fence line toward the holding pens, he was already pulling on his boots. He tracked Burke through the dark with no light and no noise, moving along the fence line in the shadows the way he'd moved through hostile country for 6 years during the war, low, patient, reading the ground before each step. Burke had 2 men with him and a plan that was simple and destructive. In the confusion of fire and stampede, the gold transfer would be contested and the sale voided. Gideon disarmed the first man before Burke knew he was there. The second man ran. Burke turned with a pistol raised and found himself looking at the barrel of the Winchester from 10 feet away, held one-handed, perfectly steady. "Put it down," Gideon said. Burke put it down. The U. Marshal's office was 2 streets over. Burke was in custody before midnight, his 2 associates not far behind. Gideon walked back to the rooming house, set the Winchester by the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Rosa was awake. She looked at him across the dark room. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. She nodded once and lay back down and was asleep in 4 minutes. Gideon sat a while longer, listening to the quiet of a town that didn't know or care what had almost happened to it tonight. And then he lay down too. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of anything at all. The next morning, Rosa stood in the buyer's office and told a room full of stockyard men something she'd been carrying since the weigh-in. Honesty and skill aren't measured by a person's gender. They are measured by the truth on that scale. She looked around the room steadily. Remember that the next time a woman brings you cattle. Nobody argued with her. They came home on a Friday. The valley looked different to Rosa after 23 days away, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought it would look the same. Instead, it looked like something she'd earned: the brown grass on the ridge, the blue line of mountains, the smoke rising from the homestead chimneys. She felt the specific weight of the gold in the strongbox under the wagon seat, and she felt the weight of what it was about to mean to 11 families, and both weights together were something she was glad to be carrying. Bat drove the wagon. Gideon rode beside it. His arm was still in the sling, but the shoulder was healing properly now, and he'd stopped moving. Like every step cost him something. Toby met them at the bottom of the ridge road on his horse, which he was still learning to ride, with the brace on his leg. He'd gotten considerably better at it in their absence. He pulled up beside the wagon and looked at Rosa with his direct, serious face. "How much?" he said. $12 a head, Rosa said. Toby did the math in his head. She watched him do it. His eyes went wide. $26,304, she finished. "Yes." Toby looked at the strongbox, and then at Rosa, and then at Gideon, and then back at Rosa. Then he turned his horse around and rode back up the ridge road ahead of them. And from the set of his shoulders, she could tell he was working very hard not to whoop. She let him have it. She understood the feeling entirely. The distribution meeting was held the next morning at the Hayes widows' property, which had the largest kitchen table and the most central location. All 11 families came. Rosa had stayed up until midnight doing the final calculations, writing each family's share on a separate slip of paper based on their headcount contribution to the drive. She stood at the head of Mrs. Hayes's table and went through it family by family, calling the name and the number and sliding the paper across. The room was very quiet while she did it. The Breckenridge family, $418. The Parson holding, $682. Old Mr. Parson looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. He said nothing. Rosa moved on, Mrs. Cordelia Hayes, $366. The widow took the slip of paper and held it in both hands and looked at it and then looked at Rosa and said, "My husband worked 20 years for less than this." Her voice was steady. "Thank you. You earned it," Rosa said. "Your cattle earned it." She worked through all 11. The tax debt $500 came off the top before distribution, set aside in a separate envelope that Gideon picked up without ceremony and put in his coat pocket. That was one problem solved in under a minute. When the meeting broke up, people moved slowly, the way they do when something large has happened and they're not quite ready to stop being in the room where it happened. Families stood in the yard in the spring sunshine, talking. Children ran between the adults' legs. Old Mr. Parson stood near the fence by himself, and Rosa saw him read his slip of paper 2 more times before he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket close to his chest. She watched that and felt something settle in her that had been restless for a long time. Gideon came to stand beside her. They watched the yard together. "Your father's in town," he said quietly. "Checked into the hotel 2 days ago." Rosa had known this was coming and had been deciding for 240 miles and 23 days of hard work what she was going to do about it. She'd made her decision somewhere around the Canadian River. "I know," she said. "I'll go this afternoon." Ephraim Mercer was not a man who expected to be surprised. He had spent 60 years being the person in every room who already knew how things were going to end. Rosa understood that about him better than he probably understood it about himself. She found him in the hotel dining room, eating lunch alone. He looked up when she came in, and she saw it just for a moment, the particular expression of a man bracing himself for something he knows he deserves. He covered it quickly with his usual composure, but she'd seen it, and that was enough. She sat down across from him without being invited. She put an envelope on the table between them. He looked at it. $4,000, she said. "Your freight fleet was seized by the bank 3 days ago when the syndicate collapsed. I bought it back." Ephraim was very still. "The wagons are in good repair. The contracts are current. The routes are profitable." Rosa folded her hands on the table. "Bat Tolliver will manage the operation. He knows the routes better than anyone alive, and he's been managing difficult things competently for 30 years. She paused. "You'll drive." He looked up at her then. "I'll drive, wagon driver. The same work the men you've employed for 30 years have done." Her voice was even. "Not cold, not cruel. Just clear. You're good with horses, and you know every road in this territory. That's the job." He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. His face was doing something complicated that she hadn't seen on it before. "Rosalie," he said. His voice came out rough on the edges. "I saved your livelihood," she said. "Not because you deserve it. You don't, not yet. But because I refuse to become the cold, heartless tyrant you were." She stood up. "Drive those wagons and earn back your own dignity. That's something you'll have to do yourself." She left the envelope on the table and walked out. She was 2 steps into the street when she heard his chair push back inside the dining room. She didn't stop or look back. She had said what needed saying, and she meant every word of it, and she was done. Gideon was waiting outside with the horses. He looked at her face. "How did it go?" "Like pulling a bullet," she said. "Necessary and then finished." He handed her the reins to the bay. She swung up, and they turned for the ridge. 2 days later, Bat Tolliver drove the first Barar freight wagon out of the Rand Creek depot. Ephraim Mercer sat in the driver's seat beside him, learning the route. At the edge of town, Bat passed Ephraim a letter that Rosa had left with him. Ephraim opened it and read it, one-handed, keeping his eyes on the road. She had written simply, "I saved your livelihood, not because you deserve it, But because I refused to become the cold, heartless tyrant you were. Drive these wagons and earn back your own dignity. Below that, she had signed it. Bar freight. Your daughter. Ephraim folded the letter. He put it in his breast pocket. He kept his eyes on the road. After a while, Bat glanced over at him. The old man's jaw was set. His eyes were wet. He didn't say anything about it, and Bat had the good sense not to either. They drove on. The proud old man wept in remorse. For most of the first mile, quietly, with his face turned toward the road and his hands steady on the reins. By the second mile, he'd stopped. By the third, he was listening to Bat explain the depot schedule with the careful attention of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was a great deal left to learn. The tax notice had sat on Gideon's kitchen table for 6 months. He picked it up on a Tuesday morning, folded it once, and walked to the county clerk's office in Rand Creek with $500 in gold coin in a canvas bag. Rosa went with him. Toby went too, though nobody had told him to. He just appeared at the door when they were leaving, hat on, crutch under his arm ready. The clerk took the money, stamped the notice paid, filed it. The whole thing took 11 minutes. On the walk back, Toby said, "That's it?" "That's it," Gideon said. Toby considered that for a moment. All those years of scouting contracts and eating thin for 11 minutes of paperwork. More or less. Huh. He thought about it some more. Worth it? Gideon looked down at him. Every day, Toby nodded, like that settled something, and swung himself forward on the crutch and didn't bring it up again. Gideon had arranged the town gathering for the following Saturday. He hadn't told anyone specifically what it was for, which in a valley of this size meant that everyone came because curiosity is the most powerful force in a small community, and always has been. The gather point was the flat ground in front of the old county office building, which had been sitting vacant for 3 years with a rusted lock on the door that nobody had the key to. All 11 families came. Rosa stood beside Gideon at the front of the crowd, watching people arrive, watching Bat help Mrs. Hayes down from her wagon, watching the Breckenridge children run circles around the adults' legs. Gideon had the deed box from the county land office under his arm. He'd gone the day before and pulled it from the third-party holding where it had sat for 9 years. And he'd spent the previous evening spreading all 41 deeds across the kitchen table and going through each one carefully, making sure the transfer documents were complete and properly prepared. Rosa had watched him do it. He'd worked by lamplight for 2 hours, patient and precise, the way he did everything. At one point, he'd looked up and found her watching him, and something passed between them that didn't need to be spoken. He'd gone back to the documents, and she'd gone back to the mending in her lap, and neither of them said anything. And somehow that was the most complete conversation she'd ever had with anyone. Now he stood in front of his whole valley with the deed box and looked out at the crowd and waited for the talking to stop. It didn't take long. Gideon had a quality that most people spend their whole lives trying to manufacture and never quite get the kind of presence that makes noise feel unnecessary. He told them everything. He started with the land company and the back wages and the deeds, and he went straight through to the tax payments and the scouting contracts and the 9 years of keeping the assessor paid without ever saying a word to anyone about why his cash always ran thin. He told it plainly, the same way he told everything, with no performance and no editorializing. The crowd was very quiet. When he was done, he opened the deed box and began calling names. He called the Hayes family first. Cordelia Hayes walked forward and received the deed to her quarter section and the full parcel her husband had worked, and she held it in both hands and looked down at it, and her lips moved slightly, just once, but she didn't speak. He went through all 11. Each deed passed from his hands to the hands of the family that had worked the land for years and believed they'd been tenants this whole time. Some people cried. Some people shook his hand so hard he had to brace his shoulder against it. Old Mr. Parsons stood in front of him for a long moment without taking the deed at all, just looking at Gideon with the measuring gaze of a man trying to understand something that doesn't fit any category he has. "You paid taxes on my land for 9 years," he said. "Yes, with your own wages. Yes, and never asked for anything back." Gideon looked at him. "It was your land. You'd worked it. Seemed right." Parson took the deed. He shook Gideon's hand once, firmly, and stepped back without another word. But Rosa, watching from the side, saw the old man's shoulders go back and his chin come up, and he stood 2 inches taller than he had before. Someone in the back of the crowd called it out. She didn't see who it started somewhere in the back, and came forward like a wave. "Cattle King," somebody said. Then more voices picked it up, and then it was the whole crowd, the particular sound of a community, recognizing something true about one of its own, and Gideon stood in the middle of it and looked profoundly uncomfortable. He turned to Rosa. He took her hand, which was so uncharacteristically public for him, that it made the crowd quiet down to hear what came next. "This valley has no king," he said. "Loud enough for everyone. It has a queen who saved us all." The crowd's response to that was louder than anything that had come before. Rosa felt heat come up in her face, which was not something that happened to her often, and she made a mental note to have a conversation with Gideon later about warning a person before saying things like that in public. But later, right now, she squeezed his hand once and let him have it. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the antique iron key. He'd carried it for 9 years. Handled it enough that the ring was worn smooth as riverstone. He held it up briefly so people could see it, though most of them didn't know what it opened. Then he walked to the door of the old county office building and fitted the key into the rusted lock. It turned. The door swung open, the hinges complaining loudly, and the inside of the building let out the particular exhale of a space that had been sealed for a long time. Dusty light, old boards, a perfectly good structure that had been sitting empty and locked while the valley grew up around it. Gideon turned back to the crowd. "This building belongs to the valley," he said. "I'd like it to be a schoolhouse. For the children." He left the key in the lock. Rosa looked at the key hanging there in the open door and thought about the night she'd first found it in his coat pocket, and the weight of what it had meant, and what it opened, and what it had been protecting all that time. She understood, standing there, that there are people in this world who carry their goodness quietly and never ask to be credited for it, and that those people are rare, and that knowing one, really knowing one, down to the early morning forge sessions, and the night terrors, and the deliberate care with which he held everything he was responsible for, that was not something you could put a price on. The crowd began to move, families talking, children running into the empty schoolhouse to see it, the particular energy of a community that had just collectively exhaled after holding its breath for a long season. Rosa and Gideon walked back to the wagon slowly, not hurrying. Toby had already unhitched the team and was watering the horses at the public trough with the efficiency of a boy who finds things to do so. Adults can have a moment. Rosa looked up at the blue sky over Rand Creek Valley, the mountains at the edge of it, the spring grass coming up green between the brown where the winter had killed it back. "You should have told them sooner," she said. Not accusatory, just honest. "I know they would have helped. I know that too." He was quiet a moment. "I didn't know how to let people help me. I'd been doing it alone long enough that I forgot it was an option." She looked at him. "You're not doing it alone anymore." He looked back at her. "No, I'm not." That afternoon, they rode out to the Bitterbutt Ridge pastures together, the wide spring grass running gold and green in every direction. The herd spread out across the lower fields in the easy, unhurried way of cattle that have been well handled and are not afraid of anything. The ridge rose behind them. The sky went on forever. Gideon pulled a small cloth from his coat pocket. Inside it was a ring, plain gold, heavy and well-made. He'd had it cast in Dodge City from a small portion of the gold they'd brought back, a jeweler on Front Street who'd done the work in 2 hours and charged him fairly and asked no questions. He took Rosa's left hand. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first night she'd come up the ridge on a borrowed mule and made her practical proposal in his plain little cabin, steadily and completely, not looking away. He put the ring on her finger. "I know we did this backward," he said. "The wedding first, and the rest of it after." "Most things worth doing don't go in order," Rosa said. He looked at the ring on her hand. Then he looked at her face. The kiss was not careful. It had nothing of the first one about it, that tentative, almost thing under the prairie stars. This was the kiss of two people who had been through fire and flood and hard arithmetic together, and had come out the other side with no reservations left. She put her hand against his jaw, and he held her like something he'd been afraid of losing and now wasn't afraid of anymore. Around them the cattle grazed, and the ridge wind moved through the spring grass, and the valley spread out below in every direction, free and wide and belonging to the people who had earned it. Bitterbutt Ridge, the Bar R brand. 11 families on their own land, a schoolhouse with a key left in the lock, and two people on horseback in the afternoon light who had found in each other the one thing neither of them had thought to plan for. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. And that, friends, is the story of Bitterbutt Ridge. But before we ride off into that sunset together, I want to sit with you for just a moment, because a story like this one doesn't come along without leaving something behind in your chest, something worth naming. Rosa Mercer walked out of her father's office with $11, a borrowed mule, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. She didn't have a plan that made sense on paper. She didn't have safety nets or guarantees. What she had was the clarity to know that a life handed to her by someone else wrapped in legal language and called protection was no life at all. And she had the spine to say no to it, even when no cost her everything she'd ever known. That's the first lesson this story carries. Real security doesn't come from who you belong to. It comes from what you're willing to build. Rosa didn't wait to be rescued. She showed up at a stranger's door in the cold and made a proposal. She brought her skills, her honesty, and her willingness to work, and she offered them as equal terms, not as charity. In a world that kept trying to write her story for her, she picked up the pen herself. And then there's Gideon Hawk. Quiet, steady Gideon, the man the whole valley had written off as broke, strange, and not worth much. But while they were busy forming opinions about him from a distance, he was doing something none of them would ever have thought to do. He was paying taxes on their land, quietly, out of his own thin wages. For 9 years. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because he expected to be thanked. Because it was right. And he knew it was right. And that was enough reason for him. We live in a time that rewards loudness, that mistakes visibility for virtue and performance for character. Gideon Hawk is the quiet argument against all of that. Goodness carried in silence, over years, without an audience, that is the rarest kind of goodness there is. And this story asks you to consider, who in your life is doing that right now? Who is holding things together without saying a word? Who have you maybe looked past because they didn't make noise about what they were doing? There's a third thing I want to leave you with, and it's this. Rosa and Gideon found each other not because the world was kind to them. It wasn't. They found each other because they were both, in their own ways, honest. Honest about what they needed. Honest about what they could offer. Honest enough to say, all right, to a practical proposal in a cold cabin over 2 cups of coffee, and then honest enough, slowly, to let it become something neither of them had planned for. The most durable love stories aren't built on grand gestures. They're built on showing up, on doing the work, on the long, quiet accumulation of trust between two people who keep choosing each other, day after day, in the ordinary moments that nobody else sees. 11 families got their deeds back. A schoolhouse got its door opened. A valley that had been holding its breath for nearly a decade finally exhaled. and two people, on horseback in the afternoon light, with the spring grass running gold and green around them, found in each other the one thing neither of them had thought to plan for. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. So wherever you are right now, whether you're riding through your own hard season, whether someone has tried to put their name on your story without your permission, whether you've been the quiet one holding things together and wondering if it matters, I hope this story reminded you of something true. Your worth is not decided by who claims you. Your character is built in what you do when nobody's watching. And the life you're brave enough to reach for, even on a borrowed mule in the cold, is always worth the ride. Thank you for spending this time with Rosa, Gideon, and the people of Rand Creek Valley. I'll see you at the next story. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.